Rupert Jones is a retired British Army Major General. He was a commanding officer of the UK troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Welcome to our program, General Jones.
Very nice to be with you. Thank you.
North Korea will send 100,000 soldiers to Russia to help Kremlin to capture the whole of Ukraine, according to Bloomberg. Meanwhile, US President Joe Biden has allowed Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia with American-made missiles. At the same time, Kremlin threatens the West with a global war in retaliation to such authorization to strike deep inside Russia. What is your reaction to these developments?
I think my first reaction is to say it's very long overdue. You know that the West, the United States, in one hand have been supporting Ukraine incredibly with equipment and with capability. But too often, in my judgment, they've come with restrictions, limitations on what equipment was being provided and the manner in which the equipment is used. So we remember, don't we, the long delay in the provision of main battle tanks, the long delay in the provision of F-16 jets, and then the provision of these long-range missiles, but they've come with restrictions on their use. And those restrictions have not been consistent with the normal rules of armed conflict, because Ukraine is quite within its rights to strike into Russia on a self-defense basis against legitimate military targets. And yet the West has been giving these long-range weapons, but have not been allowing Ukraine to use them in a manner that is consistent with self-defense.
From your perspective, how can Kremlin react to this American decision?
Well, we've started to see some reaction already, not from President Putin himself, but from others. And I think we can all predict very accurately how President Putin will respond, at least in terms of what he says. So we know that he uses very exaggerated language about, this sort of thing being a preview into a third world war, and it'll be if NATO does this, if America does this, that this will be tantamount to wider war against Russia. He's used these sort of threatening tactics all the way through the last 3 years, so we shouldn't be surprised if he does it again. But President Putin has consistently demonstrated an inability to really back his words up with action, and indeed often that they're just idle threats. So I don't expect to see a significant change in his strategy. I regret, and you will know this, it is entirely possible that he will seek to strike Ukraine even harder, but I don't think it'll fundamentally change his actions on the ground. What he might do, of course, is try and punish the West, punish the United States in other ways. And he's threatened this in the past. And that might mean, for example, providing his weapons to other actors who pose a threat to the West, whether that's to the Houthi rebels in Yemen, but impose a penalty on the West beyond the field of battle in Ukraine.
How can you assess the North Korean involvement in this war? Up to 100,000 soldiers could be deployed to support Russia's war effort in the Kursk region. How can this US authorization to use ATACMS systems influence the involvement of North Korean troops in this battlefield, in this battle?
Yes, well, there is a suggestion, isn't there, that the decision by President Biden to relax the restriction on the use of long-range weapons is a response to the deployment of North Korean troops into Russia, into the Kursk region. Whether that is a direct correlation, it's hard to say. But the deployment of North Korean troops into the fight is very significant. Not necessarily because of the quantity of troops that North Korea can provide. You'll have more accurate and up-to-date feed than I do, but the figures I see is about 12,000 troops already committed into the Kursk region. in the greater scheme of things, that's very small numbers compared with what Russia is deploying against your forces, and indeed a small number given the very high casualties that the Russians suffer day in and day out. But it is significant in strategic terms because it is one of Russia's malign allies, North Korea, stepping in to support President Putin. Of course, North Korea have been providing weaponry in very significant numbers to Russia for a considerable period of time. But this is the first time we've seen a sovereign state providing troops to the fight. And of course, this is where Moscow's statements about America allowing long-range artillery being an escalation is so ridiculous, because all the America is doing is allowing Ukraine to apply self-defense with weaponry provided by America. Whereas what the North Koreans are doing is actively putting their troops, their national troops, onto the battlefield in the fight.
Do you believe that North Korean troops can help Vladimir Putin to achieve his goals in Ukraine?
Well, they're well-trained troops. I don't think we should underestimate those North Korean troops. They're well-trained because, of course, North Korea faces or threatens a very real conflict in Korea on the peninsula. So North Korean troops are well-trained. They're undoubtedly disciplined and pretty zealous in their fervor, not least because they know if they don't fight, the regime in North Korea will do pretty unpleasant things to them and to their families. So they're motivated by fear. I suspect, as I say, they're very disciplined. So are they likely to be better individual soldiers than many of the Russians we're seeing on the front today? Yes, I think they will be as individual soldiers. But how Russia will integrate a North Korean force on the battlefield remains to be seen. Language difficulties can be overcome through interpreters, but it's about much more than that. It's about integration of capability, integration of doctrine, integration of training. And these forces have not trained alongside each other. It's not like bringing together two NATO nations and asking them to operate together who already have common standards and protocols. So can they have an impact, at the low tactical level? Yes, of course they can. Is it important strategically? Yes, it is. But do I think it'll have a really significant operational impact? I'm not sure that it will.
Do you believe that U.S. authorization for Ukraine to use long-range strikes inside Russia can dramatically change course of this war in Ukraine's favor?
Well, we've asked ourselves these sort of questions every time a restriction has been eased. So I mentioned earlier the provision of main battle tanks, the provision of F-16 jets. Each time these sorts of things happen, we have this conversation with ourselves. And you will understand that war is about the orchestra of war. It's about all the different tools. No one tool, no one piece of equipment, no one capability will fundamentally change the landscape of the war. So that was the case when tanks were provided. It will also be the case now with the loosening of the restrictions on the use of ATACMS. It can't fundamentally change the course of the war, but it is undoubtedly helpful to loosen what was a very, very unhelpful restriction. Now, what it does mean is that Ukraine can now, as I said earlier, properly act in self-defense by striking legitimate targets in depth. That will place real challenges on the Russians because, of course, they've been able to take advantage of this restriction by putting military facilities much closer to the front line than they'd been able to do otherwise. Sure, in the knowledge that American provided equipment could not be used to strike them. So that's logistic depots, it's command and control nodes, it's build up formation assembly areas. All of those sorts of facilities will now be at threat and will be legitimate targets and achievable targets for the Ukrainians.
Could this force Vladimir Putin to a negotiations table?
I wish it were possible, but no, I don't judge that to be likely. Certainly not as a result of this one move. As I say, I don't think the provision of or using ATACMS on a long range basis will fundamentally change the war in that way. You know, the best way to get Putin into a position to negotiate is by creating the very best conditions on the ground, and that has to mean changing the overall initiative on the battlefield, getting Ukraine on the front foot and beginning to push Russia back. And of course, we have the spectre of President Trump coming back into office in the new year, and the stronger position Ukraine finds itself on the battlefield at that point, the better.
From your perspective, can this decision of Biden White House, of Biden administration to allow Ukraine to strike back with US-made weapons influence the policy of future Trump's administration, as you just mentioned about Donald Trump? Because we have heard some plans to freeze this conflict on the current front lines. What is your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should all be cautious of predicting too much about what President Trump will do. He's his own man. He's demonstrated he could be quite unpredictable. So the reality is, despite lots of proclamations by the people who are going to work with him, until he's in office, I think we don't know. He will, I'm sure, want to bring meaning to what he said in the past about bringing the war to an end. But that need not necessarily be to Ukraine's disadvantage. It may mean, who knows, that actually he doubles down in his support to Ukraine and is more aggressive in his support to Ukraine. So I think, I don't think we should prejudge the outcome, and we should be cautious of paying too much heed to the words he used during the election process and prior to coming into office. So I think it'll be interesting. I think the other thing to say, President Trump likes to show himself as a strong man, and so he will inherit a situation where American weapons are being used on a long-range basis. So will he want to immediately rescind that freedom? I would suspect not. I suspect he does want to appear to be the strong man. He doesn't want to appear weak. He doesn't want to create the conditions where Ukraine are defeated effectively on the battlefield. I just don't think that plays effectively to his wider narrative. So I think, again, I hope we're going to see a more nuanced set of policies out of Trump than some are predicting. We'll see.
So if Donald Trump tries to stop Ukraine for using long-range strike inside Russia, if he reverses Biden's policy and, for example, refuses policy to be in action and does not allow Ukraine to strike inside Russia, this decision would make him more weak on the world stage, more weaker position.
Yeah, that would be my judgment. Who knows how he will view it? But my judgment is that reversing this decision will make him look weak. He does not like to look weak. He has all politicians do, but he's got a hell of an ego, and he won't want to look weak. He won't want to be mocked. He will want, he says he wants to do something really strategic, change the course of this war. I think it will be hard for him to reverse this sort of decision without appearing weak.
How can Donald Trump double down support for Ukraine if he decides to do so, does the US still have enough leverage on Vladimir Putin? What are his tough options on Vladimir Putin? More strikes inside Russia, even more range deep inside Russia, and other weapons. What are the tough options for Donald Trump in case if he decides to be tough on Vladimir Putin?
Well, let me approach that from a different way. What he won't want to do is to repeat what happened with President Biden at the end of the Afghanistan campaign, where President Biden was made to look weak in the manner in which American forces, and by extension NATO forces, left Afghanistan. It was pretty ignominious. For those of us who served there, it was pretty distasteful. It left Afghans in a very, very difficult position. President Trump will have that memory in his mind, I'm sure. And despite all of his talk of ending the war in a day, he is no fool. And he will be trying to work out ways to bring the war in Ukraine to a rapid conclusion, certainly, but not in a way that makes him look weak, and not in a way that undermines American interests. And, you know, for all the talk of making America great again, that isn't done through a wholly independent optic. He knows that America's place in the world matters. He knows that enough of his reputation will need to be based around international affairs, that he has to find a way to precipitate the conclusion of the war. But I don't think that automatically means to Ukraine's disadvantage.
What is your assessment of the possibility of creating a demilitarized zone along the front lines in Ukraine? And what is your take on such idea of freezing this conflict with demilitarized zone and even ground deployment of UK, British, European troops to enforce this demilitarized zone on the ground in Ukraine? What is your take on that? And do you believe that Vladimir Putin will agree with such initiative?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is I think, President Putin is almost impossible to negotiate with. You have to be able to negotiate with somebody who negotiates in good faith. No conversation with President Putin could be judged to happening in good faith. So I have concerns about the idea of negotiating with President Putin. I'm also skeptical about the idea of a true demilitarized zone with peacekeepers. So I could, of course, be proved wrong, but I struggle with the idea of peacekeepers coming to the front line. Would Putin ever accept? You mentioned British, French. These are troops from NATO nations. I cannot conceive of that being deemed acceptable, and I think it unlikely that troops from non-NATO regions would come in under a UN umbrella. So I personally have a difficulty with the idea of a true demilitarized zone. I do think some kind of frozen conflict, deeply distasteful though it may be to President Zelensky and indeed to the Ukrainian people, I regret that I do think that is a more likely outcome. And of course, this is something that Ukraine has faced previously after the original invasion by Russia into Ukraine, into Crimea and elsewhere. De facto, as you know, your forces faced a frozen conflict. There was a front line, but there wasn't a lot of movement on that front line. I think it is possible that events on the ground turn into some kind of frozen conflict. And over a longer term, that may lead into some kind of UN-led peace process. But I think the idea of a true negotiation with President Trump is a fool's errand.
And from your perspective, how can Ukraine and the West reach at least frozen conflict, at least this type of situation, at the same time when Russia continues to move forward on the east of Ukraine?
Well, I mean, this is the challenge, isn't it? Because, again, forgive me, I know you and your listeners know this better than I do. That events on the ground do the talking, and you have to come from a position of strength. So the more sovereign Ukrainian territory that Ukraine is in control of, when, if you like, the shooting stops, the better. And that means that the Ukrainian military has to stem the reverses that they've been suffering in central Ukraine in the first instance. But it also means, for me, that is why the attack into Kursk was so important. I confess I thought far too much of the commentary after Ukraine attacked Kursk was off the mark, and it talked about trying to pull Russian reserves away from the center. For me, it was nothing about that. I feel confident the reason President Zelensky did it and his generals advised it was to create a real strategic, not an operational, but a strategic dilemma to President Putin. By taking control of some sovereign Russian territory, that is a real strategic play because it gives genuine leverage as the war comes towards a conclusion. Because President Putin is a proud man. The Russian people are a proud people, and they will not like the fact there are Ukrainian troops on Russian soil. That does give Ukraine some bargaining power. And you've got to have some kind of bargaining power because, again, it's events on the ground. There's a reality that is happening in Kursk that Putin will also have to deal with. So it does seem to me that gives Ukraine a stronger position than they would otherwise have.
Would it be difficult for Ukraine to move even more deep inside the Kursk region, or it wouldn't be necessary because it would be better for Ukraine to hold captured terrain and to repel recent Russia's and North Korean attacks inside the Kursk region of Russia?
So if I was, based on what I know, if I was giving advice, I would say you don't need more territory. It's the mere fact that you are holding some Russian territory. It doesn't matter whether you double that in size. I was a great believer that after the original incursion into Kursk, what needed to happen was to secure defensible terrain, whether that's riverlines, hill features, but get yourself onto a position that you can then dig in and defend and hold. Now, we know that the Russians have retaken some of that territory. Again, in a way, that doesn't matter, so long as Ukrainian forces can hold enough of what they currently have. I don't judge that they need more, they just need some. It's the mere fact that they are inside Russia, they're holding some Russian terrain. That's the strategic power of it. And as I say, whether that's double the amount of terrain, I don't think that fundamentally changes the calculus. And the idea that Ukrainian forces could now go on another offensive out of their current salient in Kursk, I think is unlikely. So just really hold aggressively what you've got.
Do you believe in any kind of security guarantees from the West in case of a peaceful settlement, in case of a ceasefire, in case of a frozen conflict in Ukraine? Do you believe in such scenario? Because when Ukraine and Russia held peace talks in 2022, Vladimir Putin refused for Ukraine. He refused the idea of Ukraine receiving security guarantees from the West, and according to the New York Times, that was a reason why the peace talks failed, because Russia did not want Ukraine to obtain any kind of serious security guarantees from the West.
I think your characterization is exactly right, but this goes back to what I said earlier. It is almost impossible to negotiate with President Putin. He's a barefaced liar. You cannot negotiate in good faith with leaders who are liars. He only respects strength. Now, I think that early in the conflict, NATO leaders did quite a good job in giving early support to Ukraine and moderating their stance to ensure that the war did not escalate. But quite quickly, it became clear that the Russian military were not capable of really escalating the conflict and that President Putin was unlikely to do so. And I do think, therefore, that NATO, Western nations, should be bolder in giving genuine guarantees to Ukraine, to President Zelensky, to the people of Ukraine, because you are fighting for yourselves, but you're also fighting for wider Europe. You're fighting for stability and peace in the world. And I think frankly, it's the least that the West can do is to give President Zelensky some of those security guarantees.
And my last question for you, do you think that France and the United Kingdom have also allowed Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia with long-range cruise missiles? Reuters reported that both French and British governments have not commented on this in this question. What is your reaction to this? How can you assess this?
Yes, I mean, I would expect that Britain and France will wish to provide a similar lift of the restrictions. But in the case of the British weapon, Storm Shadow, it has American technology within it. And as you know, previously, therefore, Britain has sought the support of the United States before lifting that restriction. One would like to think that if Britain now asks America for permission to lift the restrictions, that America will do so. I'm sure there'll be side discussions during the G20 summit, and I would very much hope that Britain and France will be able, therefore, to make a similar lifting of that restriction.
Thank you, General Jones, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much. And as always, Ukraine and all your people are in our thoughts.